The Prime Minister and the First Minister are to meet with Nicola Sturgeon, accusing the PM of blaming everybody else for the failure of her withdrawal agreement. It's believed the First Minister's Brexit Secretary Mike Russell will join her in London for the talks, following meetings in Brussels yesterday with some of the European Parliament's Brexit steering group. Well, the SNP MEP Alyn Smith was involved in those meetings, and he joins us now from Brussels. Good morning to you.
Morning, Gary.
What is your sense of what Brussels is feeling as regards the Brexit situation?
Well, to coin a phrase, nothing has changed. The sense of frustration with how the UK has been doing this, and from the very get-go, Mrs May put in a series of red lines to the talks. So the reason why she's delivered a deal to the House of Commons that doesn't please people who were Remain-minded, also doesn't please people who were Leave-minded, is precisely because she's tried to please all the people and delivered something that is unacceptable to everybody. So there are other ways that we could do this. Brussels is very good at finding solutions, but all the problems have been set in London and are continuing to be in a complete situation of impasse there. So we do need to try and break out of this. Brussels would stand ready for that, but so long as Mrs May's red lines remain absolutely part of how she's going to do things, then there's only so many options available.
But you give the impression that there is a solution that Parliament would back. At the moment, that doesn't seem to be the case, does it? There doesn't seem to be a majority for any of the ideas that have been put forward, even the ideas put forward by your party and the First Minister.
Well, this is where, again, I have to say that Mrs May has done this. If anybody's feeling remotely sympathetic to Mrs May for the problem that she's in, remember, she did it. Now, the SNP, we accepted the result of the 2014 referendum on independence, obviously. We put forward a series of proposals after the EU referendum where Scotland's position was very clear. But it's possible to leave the EU, for example, but remain within the customs union, the single market. That would solve the problems in Northern Ireland. We put that forward as a compromise.
But there's not a majority for those options at Westminster. I understand why you blame Mrs May for the situation we're in, but she has to face the reality of Parliament not backing any of these options.
But that's the thing, to finish my point, she's not allowed any of those arguments to continue because she's set red lines artificially on the process where, because of her fixation with freedom of movement, that has precluded any serious discussion of the single market as an option. So the House of Commons now, having worked out that it doesn't like her deal, is only just starting to seriously look at all the other options 2 years into this process.
But that's not strictly true, because the Labour Party actually have ruled out the idea of staying in the single market because partly of that freedom of movement issue that you have mentioned.
Well, parts of the Labour Party have, and for the life of me, I can't work out what the Labour Party's position actually is, because if you talk to different people on different days, you'll get a different set of answers. Now, the SNP's position is clear. We want to remain within the EU. If we can't do that, we want to remain within the single market and the customs union, and we want to see the UK do that too. I think that's actually a resting place that we could find a majority for in the House of Commons, much as it's a poorer option to the deal we have now. But what Mrs May's done is shut down options in this discussion artificially, and what we need to do is to open up that process again. And sadly, colleagues across the EU 27 are looking at us, where the UK had a reputation for actually being serious and by and large getting what it wanted in agreements, is now looking increasingly flaky.
But the EU want Mrs May to reopen the situation in the UK, and obviously she has to do something to try and get her deal through Parliament, but the EU seems to be refusing to reopen any negotiations on their front, and there are some Brexiteers who are accusing the EU of belligerence.
Well, they're blaming everybody but themselves. I mean, the EU doesn't want us to leave at all. The EU is very open to a Norway-type situation where we'd be in the single market customs union. Obviously, there would be things to discuss about that. But the trouble is that Mrs May has been very clear from the outset that she doesn't want to talk about those options, so they've not been explored. And now we find ourselves where the House of Commons is united that they don't want her deal. They're not, exactly as you say, they're not united around any other option. But I think in the coming weeks we'll see what that's going to be. The trouble that we have is because the clock is ticking so much and we're very much against the end of this process. Article 50 is a 2-year time-limited process unless the UK applies to extend that, and it needs to extend that for a valid reason, not just another 6 months of nonsense. So we are very much towards the end of the process, and I fear that we're going to just exit the EU with actually no idea of what the end point's going to be.
Well, of course, we are to get a series of amendments to the deal next week laid before Parliament. Yvette Cooper, the Labour backbencher, has laid down one amendment which in effect would rule out a no deal. We've yet to see if the Speaker actually accepts that, but we've got John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, saying today that Labour is likely to back that Yvette Cooper amendment. So if enough Labour MPs come in behind that, then it looks as though one of the things that your party's been calling for, ruling out a no-deal Brexit, potentially might pass at Westminster.
Well, this is where the perspective from Brussels on no deal is really quite different. I mean, the fact that there's a majority in the House of Commons against no deal or to stop no deal happening, so what? Article 50 is a time-limited period, and the UK will exit the EU on the 29th of March in the absence of either Mrs May's deal or a deal being agreed, or Article 50 being revoked altogether, which would be my preference, or cancelled, or delayed, extended.
But if there was a vote for a no deal next week, if Yvette Cooper's amendment passed, for instance, then it would naturally follow that Mrs May would have to go back and ask for Article 50 to be extended, wouldn't it?
Well, extended for what? And this is where I was involved in the court case with Andy Whiteman and a series of others, Scots politicians in the Court of Justice, that has now proven in black and white that the UK can unilaterally revoke Article 50. But if the UK is looking to extend Article 50, that needs to be done with the consent of all the 27 other countries. So they're going to ask, well, if you want to extend it, for what? Do you want to do it to complete your ratification? Do you want to do it for a referendum? Do you want to do it for maybe there's a general election in the offing? Who knows? But there needs to be a thing. You can't just have another 6 months because the UK has been rubbish for 2 years. So there's a lot of moving parts to this, and it grieves me that we're only now starting to see the House of Commons actually engage with the other options that have been floating around for the past 2 years.
Nicola Sturgeon is saying today that Scotland has the option of independence in the Brexit crisis. That seems to be one of the messages that she's taking to Downing Street. There is some frustration, it seems, in the SNP that she talks about this a lot, but actually doesn't actually give us a date as to when this might happen. We had Angus MacNeil, the MP, saying, actually, never mind the idea of a people's vote going back to the people on Brexit. Let's have a vote on independence. Is now the time to do that?
Well, there is a seething frustration across the whole of Scotland with how Scotland's being treated over Brexit, given our clear vote to remain and how we've been treated since. Within the SNP and the Yes movement, yes, there are a number of folks who think we should just go for independence now. I am not of that view, and I can't speak for the First Minister on this, but certainly I'm not of the view, because there are practical questions about what the independence proposition is going to be vis-à-vis the EU and vis-à-vis the rest of the UK. And until we see where the end point of the UK is likely to be relative to the EU, then there are practical questions that we're not ready with yet.
Can you envisage it happening this year, though?
Jinx, I can envisage everything up to and including alien invasion in the next couple of minutes, Gary. Everything's possible. But I don't think that we're ready to press the button on an independence referendum yet, because there's too many moving parts to Brexit. All the issues that Ireland is having with the Irish border, these are issues that are very relevant to an independence proposition. But what Ireland is showing is what independence in Europe actually means, which is solidarity with the other member states of the European Union. The reason why Dublin's had the whip hand over London over this process is because the Good Friday Agreement is incredibly important and must be respected, but also because they're an independent state within the EU. So independence, yes, is one of the options.
Thank you for joining us this morning. That's the SNP MEP Alyn Smith, live from Brussels.